2 weeks ago saw the premiere of Starfleet Academy, the latest, and given the streaming contraction and the various corporate realignments taking place in Hollywood as we speak, likely the last show in the so-called Kurtzman era of the franchise that began with the launch of Star Trek Discovery almost a decade ago. And Starfleet Academy is... well, it's not very good.
Time will always fold upon itself like an origami chicken. This moment is that chicken.
So this week we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about its muddled themes, its difficulties in trying to produce a piece of Star Trek that is engaged with the modern world while still being rooted in the 90s, a series that tries to promise the next generation their own strange new world while being lost in its own past, and how the Star Trek franchise essentially gave up on the future. There will be some light spoilers here, but that's necessary if we're going to engage with the material. With that in mind, let's paraphrase the great man himself and make a show. Starfleet Academy is a show about a lost future. This makes it sound ironic that it feels so desperately and clumsily stuck in the past. Much is made of the utopian subtext of the larger Star Trek franchise, the argument that Star Trek represents a fundamentally optimistic and hopeful depiction of the future.
Poverty, disease, war, they'll all be gone within the next 50 years.
How about war? Disease, hunger. Pretty much wiped them out in less than 2 generations. I wouldn't call that small potatoes.
This reading of the franchise is largely rooted in the Star Trek television shows of the 1990s, overseen by producer Rick Berman. It is most apparent in Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager. Fans will often argue that this optimism was always part of the franchise's history, but this is something of a broad revisionist statement.
End program.
The truth is that Star Trek has always spoken more to America's present than to humanity's future. The original Star Trek was a product of the Cold War, and it reflected the stark realities of the time. Under Captain James T. Kirk, the Enterprise voyaged into a galaxy that was a graveyard of alien empires.
This is a barren world. There's hardly any vegetation, no apparent animal life.
Populated by unruly but all-powerful children.
You must forgive our child. The fault is ours for indulging him too much.
And where madness was often quite literally contagious.
As I speculated, Captain, the overall pattern of mass insanity destroying civilizations follows an almost straight line through this section of the galaxy.
When Kirk encounters another Federation installation or Starfleet ship, the crew are more likely than not dead, or vanished, or turned into space salt.
Jim, the crew didn't leave. These white crystals, that's what's left of the human body when you take the water away, which makes up 96% of our bodies.
This happens more than once, by the way. The majority of captains that Kirk encounters are completely insane.
How could you, a Starship fleet captain, believe that a Federation crew would blindly obey your order to destroy the entire Andros race?
I am master of the universe!
And there's a recurring suggestion that maybe just being on the frontier is enough to drive a person mad. You get Starfleet captains LARPing as ancient Romans, and that discounts all the times that Kirk and Spock either go insane or encounter insane doppelgangers. Star Trek fans like to argue that the Federation is ultimately, well...
famous for its universal harmony, a whole empire held together by people just being terribly nice to each other.
And while that interpretation is arguably true within the context of the Rick Berman 90s shows, in the original Star Trek, the Federation was a precarious alliance of species that seemed to be literally at one another's throats.
There will be payment for your slander, Sarek.
And it seemed entirely plausible that one member's ambassador might literally break the neck of another during tense negotiations.
Captain, you're not accusing him.
Mother, only on circumstantial evidence, he is a logical suspect.
Pretty much every representative of Federation authority that Kirk and the crew encounter is an obstacle or actively hostile.
I am forced by regulations to assume command.
Sir, you have never commanded a starship.
To the point that a Federation ambassador deciding to abandon her post to become part of a weird alien threesome is just another day at the office.
Well, I'm sure the Federation can find another woman somewhere who'll stop that war.
The galaxy was so inherently hostile that Starfleet vessels had a standing operating procedure, that's General Order 24, to destroy all life on a planet's surface from orbit, something that Kirk invokes multiple times on the show.
You heard me give General Order 24. That means in 2 hours, the Enterprise will destroy Emini 7.
Human beings existed at the whims of a hostile universe. In no small part due to the recurring contributions of Psycho author and Lovecraft protege Robert Bloch to the show, The universe of the original Star Trek is occasionally quite literally Lovecraftian in construction.
I was left here by the old ones.
J.J. Abrams' reboot understood this.
Space is disease and danger wrapped in darkness and silence.
This was because the original Star Trek was a product of its time. It arrived at a point where the United States was a dominant global superpower as the European empires crumbled to dust around them. It's also possible to draw a straight line between the original series' fixation on ancient Rome, reflected in alien planets, alien species, and even alternate universes, as reflecting an anxiety about what it meant for America to be an imperial power in the late 1960s. This is one of the reasons why you saw so many Roman epics in the post-war era, without the fact that they're really frickin' cool.
Joey, you like movies about gladiators?
Along those lines, Star Trek's preoccupation with incredibly powerful and dangerous children obviously speaks to the anxieties about the emerging youth and counterculture of the late 1960s. The franchise's recurring preoccupation with hyper-advanced computers ruling over primitive societies speaks to Cold War anxieties about the spread of communism and the erosion of individualism. The show spoke to a world that existed on the edge of mad, mutually assured destruction. Meanwhile, America was engaged in a series of proxy wars across the globe against the spread of communism. Crucially, in these parables, Starfleet and the Federation were not some imagined perfect future version of America, but a reflection of America as it existed at that moment. And Kirk would inevitably arm small local forces to help them withstand foreign imperialism, but don't worry, he'd feel bad about it afterwards, so it's okay, right?
Well, you got what you wanted.
Not what I wanted, Bones. What had to be.
Of course, we don't watch Star Trek today from the perspective of the 60s.
It's just a computer-generated fantasy. Shut this bloody thing off.
The show is colored by the audience's relationship to the Berman era that began 2 decades later. Ironically, in doing so, Star Trek's connection to its present is erased. It is instead turned into a nostalgic fetish object, some relic of an idealized romantic past. Like so many of these franchises lost in the nostalgic quagmire, Star Trek used to be about things. Now it is mostly about itself. Much of the utopianism that fans associated with Star Trek only really came about after the end of the original series. While the original Star Trek included multiple references to money,
That is like having a penny. Federation has invested a great deal of money in our training. They're about due for a small return. Mr. Chekhov, I think you've earned your pay for the week.
the Federation was only officially established as being a moneyless economy in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, released in 1986.
Don't tell me they don't use money in the 23rd century.
Well, we don't.
This new status as a moneyless economy would become a cornerstone of models of the Federation as explicitly utopian in nature.
The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
What does that mean exactly?
It means we don't need money.
1 year after the release of The Voyage Home, William T. Riker stated that the Federation was explicitly vegetarian during the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation.
We no longer enslave animals for food purposes.
Those first 2 years of The Next Generation also leaned very hard on the idea of the Federation as explicitly utopian.
People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things.
Let's just say that Picard was the kind of guy who would be more horrified to discover that a few bad apples within Starfleet had been arming guerrilla forces in proxy wars across the galaxy than he was to be the guy actually arming those forces in proxy wars himself.
I gave Karnas the weapons he wanted.
In exchange, he would get weapons.
The utopianism that was established in The Next Generation, which carried through into Voyager, was a product of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the resolution of the Cold War. It spoke to the end of history, the unipolar moment, and to American hyperpower. The United States was an uncontested global superpower. After the end of the Cold War, the Western world entered a period of what it believed to be peace and economic prosperity. Just as the worldview of the original Star Trek reflected the chaos of the late 1960s, the utopian idealism of the Berman era was not a projection of the future, but a reflection of the present. In fact, one of the reasons that The Next Generation succeeded as a spin-off is that it did not nostalgically chase the tone and mood of the 1960s original, understanding that that was a product of its own time, but instead chose to reflect the world around it and speak to its moment in its own way. Incidentally, the Berman era's refusal to keep doing this would go on to become an issue with later shows in the franchise, like Star Trek Voyager or most obviously Star Trek Enterprise, but don't worry, we'll get to that. The final movie, featuring the full original Star Trek cast, The Undiscovered Country, is quite literally about the cast of the original Star Trek recognizing the passage of time and the need for change.
How on earth can history get past people like me?
It is no longer their world.
Some people think the future means the end of history.
People can be very frightened of change.
The Next Generation offered a vision of a relatively stable and peaceful galaxy. Under Captain Jean-Luc Picard, the Enterprise was effectively a luxury hotel in space, with regular art lessons, theater performances, poetry recitals, an Oscar-winning bartender, a holodeck that is used for horse riding, and possibly other kinds of riding too, public spaces for tromboning, and actual boning.
We took a walk in the Arboretum. We sat down, we got comfortable. Things got a little romantic, and then I rolled over.
And sure, one might point to, say, the Borg, which were introduced as an existential threat to the Federation, as proof that not necessarily everything fits within this paradigm. However, it is worth considering how the Borg are treated within the Berman-era Star Trek shows. The Collective was introduced in 1989 as a monolithic entity composed of soulless mechanized automatons, the last vestiges of Cold War paranoia about the communist threat.
We're not dealing with an individual mind. They don't have a single leader. It's the collective minds of all of them.
However, by the early 90s, the Collective had all but collapsed, and the overwhelming majority of stories about the Borg became accounts of a great power that had collapsed and fractionalized into smaller groups trying to find their place in the new world.
Couldn't function. Some Borg fought each other. Others simply shut themselves down. Many starved to death.
Some of these factions of splintered Borg even fall under the sway of psychotic dictators, to reinforce the parallels with the end of the Soviet Union. Even the Borg ultimately illustrate how the tone, themes, and general mood of the Berman-era Star Trek shows are firmly anchored in the moment in which those shows were produced. And sure, you could point to Deep Space Nine, maybe the best of the Star Trek spin-offs, which threw the Federation and Starfleet into an existential war against the Dominion.
Starfleet is not a military organization.
Which was very much at odds with the mood of the 90s.
You hit me. Picard never hit me. I'm not Picard.
Part of this was down to Deep Space Nine characterizing itself in opposition to the Next Generation, as demonstrated by a tie-in to the theatrical release of Star Trek Generations, guest starring Jonathan always up for a cameo Frakes.
Looks like you've got your evening all planned. Hope you've got room for the unexpected.
That built to maybe the most delightfully insane reveal in the history of the franchise. Part of this was also just Deep Space Nine responding to the 90s in its own way. This was a few years later than the Next Generation, so it was coming off the highs at the end of the Cold War and into tragedies like Bosnia and Rwanda. And it was maybe just a little bit more skeptical of the Federation, and by implication the United States.
On Earth, there is no poverty, no crime, no war. You look out the window of Starfleet headquarters and you see paradise.
The big surprise isn't that Deep Space Nine adopted a tone more in keeping with the skepticism of the late 90s. It's that its twin series Star Trek Voyager just kept on trekking, as if it was going to be 1990 forever, serving reheated and reiterated leftovers of the Next Generation. Allowing for the few short weeks that writer Ronald D. Moore spent on the 6th season of Star Trek Voyager, Deep Space Nine served as a narrative dead end for the franchise. You can see that even in the recent wave of shows, which are littered with cameos and references to the Next Generation and Voyager, even bringing back cast members from those shows as fully fledged regulars, but which have largely ignored Deep Space Nine outside of I guess 2 episodes of Lower Decks, and an upcoming episode of Starfleet Academy.
Tacky Cardassian fascist eyesore.
Honestly, as a big Deep Space Nine fan, this might be for the best. It means that Deep Space Nine is not trapped in the same nostalgic churn as so many beloved 90s properties, that it is not subject to revision and reworking and reimagining, is instead allowed to stand as its own thing, in its own moment of its own time. It is afforded the rarest of things in modern pop culture, an actual ending. To emphasize how closely that explicitly utopian vision of Star Trek was anchored in the broader cultural context of the 90s, it's worth considering Enterprise. Star Trek Enterprise. Never mind. That never happened. Pay no attention. Launched in 2001 as the franchise's first prequel, Enterprise signaled a moment when Star Trek gave up on its own future. It no longer pressed forward, instead turning inwards on itself. Developed before but launched after 9/11, Enterprise spent its first couple of years trying to maintain that 90s sensibility into the new millennium, in a world that had moved past it. Enterprise's first 2 seasons tried to clumsily limp on as if it were business as usual, offering lame retreads of classic, or frankly not so classic, Next Generation episodes. But there was a sense that the show's heart wasn't in it, as it seemed like every First Contact mission ended with the crew deciding that maybe it was better that everybody should keep to themselves.
I guess we won't be adding the Arconians to our list of friends.
Person who'd still be alive if we hadn't made first contact.
As much as those first 2 seasons of Enterprise wanted to believe that the Star Trek franchise could remain frozen in that 90s worldview if it tried hard enough, the reality is that you can't go back, and that those attempts curdled into something rancid, stale, and unconvincing. While the Next Generation had succeeded because it was able to change with the times, Voyager and the early seasons of Enterprise failed because they tried to stubbornly remain stuck in that moment. Too little, too late? Enterprise's 3rd and 4th seasons tried to draw the poison out of the wound, realizing that the 90s were over and directly asking the audience, what does it mean to be Star Trek in the middle of the War on Terror? 16 years into the Berman era, the long 90s had finally ended. Which brings us neatly to Starfleet Academy, a show about the next generation that can't let go of, well, you know what I mean here. This new era of Star Trek, overseen by Alex Kurtzman and beginning with the launch of Star Trek Discovery in 2017, has grappled with a similar but distinct existential question. What does it mean to be Star Trek in the era of Donald J. Trump? The particular contours of that question have varied from one show to the next. On Discovery, Trump was personified by Captain Gabriel Lorca, a monster from an alternate dystopian timeline where the Federation was the Terran Empire, and simultaneously by the ethno-nationalism of the Klingon Empire under T'Kuvma.
Fool, Talaram fool, Andolianam fool, cool, yeah.
On Picard, the threat was more philosophical, as the Federation itself became more isolationist and xenophobic. On Starfleet Academy, a show set in the distant future of the franchise universe, that specter manifests in various ways. It is personified in the villainous Nusbraka, played by Paul Giamatti, who according to Kurtzman represents, quote, a tide that has swept across the world in a very profound and upsetting way. More broadly, the series unfolds in a future where the Federation is attempting to recover from a disaster known as the Burn, to pull itself back together, and to repair the promise of this broken future. As the title implies, Starfleet Academy is about a younger generation. It concerns the first class of students to study at the reopened academic institution that provides the basis for Starfleet, overseen by Chancellor Nala Ake, hand chosen for the job by Starfleet Commander-in-Chief Charles Vance. Ake's primary objective is to restore a broken faith with these young children, who never knew the prosperity and stability of the Federation. This is very literally woven into the show's character arcs. In the opening scenes of the premiere, Nala is responsible for separating Caleb Meir from his mother. It's a very loaded piece of political imagery with a strong contemporary resonance. This serves as Nala's original sin. Her guilt for her complicity with that familial separation informs her work at Starfleet Academy. Nala goes out of her way to recruit Caleb among her first batch of students. The show's second episode concerns the negotiation of the readmission of Beta Z into the Federation, at the behest of a younger generation of Betazoids led by Terima Sadal.
Now these kids are inheriting a broken world they did not create but have to clean up.
Not to be too heavy-handed about it, but Beta Z really did build that wall. It's not the most subtle of political commentary. More broadly, the show is about the idea that contemporary politics have failed the younger generation. Starfleet Academy speaks very heavily to a generation that feels betrayed and abandoned by contemporary politics. The problem is that Starfleet Academy doesn't really have anything to offer this wayward generation except nostalgia, the promise that things can be made the way that they once were. Vance hires Nala to run Starfleet Academy because she is half Lanthanite. As a result, she is old enough to remember the Federation before the Burn.
You were there centuries ago when Starfleet was at its best. You can show them what that really means.
The show is saturated with nostalgia and callbacks to older Star Trek. Not only does the EMH appear as a series regular, he also gets to repeat jokes from the Voyager pilot.
Tricorder? Medical tricorder.
In its opening episode, Starfleet Academy lifts a lot from the opening of Voyager. Just as Janeway recruits Tom Paris from a Federation penal colony, Nala pulls Caleb out of prison. Just as Voyager's first mission takes it towards the Badlands, Nala pilots the Athena towards the Badlands. Just as disaster strikes and leaves large portions of the Voyager crew dead, the cadets on the Athena are forced to step up after a surprise attack leaves their ship crippled. This heavy reliance on internal continuity for the Berman-era Star Trek shows reflects a broader external nostalgia for the 1990s. This is reflected in the casting. Holly Hunter is an icon of 1980s and 1990s cinema. Nala feels like the embodiment of the same 1990s New Ageism that informed Michael Pillar's work on Deep Space Nine and Voyager. The wise old trickster lady, who's also a bit of a kook who walks around the institution in her bare feet because she's such a free spirit. There is a clear longing here to return to the 1990s. It feels very telling, for example, that the show's opening episodes focus on Beta Z's readmission to the Federation. Beta Z was one of the new planets invented for the next generation, home to Deanna Troi, and very much an expression of the notoriously horny Gene Roddenberry's sex-positive New Ageism. It was mostly an excuse for Roddenberry's wife to appear naked and then try to bang Patrick Stewart, which, to be honest, I kinda respect. The point here is that Starfleet Academy doesn't focus on one of the Federation members from the 1960s, like the Vulcans, the Andorians, or the Tellarites, retroactively established as founders of the Federation. It instead focuses on one from the 1990s. This is a fatal flaw with this era of Star Trek in general, and with Starfleet Academy in particular. It feels like the franchise has nothing new to offer audiences beyond the comforting reassurance that, to tweak a Dan Quayle quote to take us back to the 90s, the future was better yesterday. It is an understandable impulse, but is also cynical and creatively bankrupt. What is this nostalgia but just a slight variation on the nostalgia that underpins so much of the ideology that the franchise is trying to reject? While the 1990s were prosperous and relatively peaceful, so much of the chaos of the modern political moment flows as a direct consequence of decisions made during that decade. Indeed, eagle-eyed viewers can see the shadows of the California political movements of the 1990s that would birth Trumpism stirring beneath the surface of Voyager in its treatment of immigrants and refugees.
They keep coming. 2 million illegal immigrants in California.
As tempting as it might be, there is no going back. The only way out of this moment is through. A lost generation needs more than reheated leftovers of yesterday's dreams. But even setting aside the political and social commentary, even just within the world of the show, the Federation cannot have been a perfect system as it collapsed so readily into chaos. Why would a younger generation ever trust a system that crumbles under the slightest pressure? Surely, the goal should be to build something new and modern, to acknowledge the flaws in the old system, and provide a viable alternative to the darkness sweeping through the cosmos. In the fictional history of the Star Trek universe, Earth did not respond to the horror of World War III by regressing back into a world of nation-states. Instead, it evolved into something more resilient that would ensure that such a disaster would never happen again. Why would the children of Starfleet Academy bet their futures on something that already collapsed at the expense of their stability and prosperity? Starfleet Academy cannot offer an answer to that question beyond nostalgia itself. It is perhaps unfair to burden Starfleet Academy with this criticism. It was also true of the third season of Star Trek Discovery and of most of Star Trek Picard. Still, this problem is especially egregious here given how aggressively Starfleet Academy is about the need to offer a brighter future to the next generation. It can't do that when the only direction that it's boldly going is backwards. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.